A very warm welcome to St Paul's Cathedral. It is a great pleasure to be able to welcome you here this afternoon for this very special event, which is a partnership between ourselves at St Paul's Cathedral and Cumberland Lodge. In a moment, Fergus will introduce Cumberland Lodge to you, but before he does, let me introduce a little bit about St Paul's Cathedral. So my name is Paula Gooder. I'm Canon Chancellor here at St Paul's Cathedral and the Director of the St Paul's Cathedral Institute. For centuries, St Paul's Cathedral has been a centre of debate, discovery and conversation. And at the St Paul's Cathedral Institute, we use this history and identity to inspire learning and reflection today. We do this by focusing on the topics of faith, culture and society, curating conversations which explore these themes through talks, workshops, written reflections, online conversations and podcasts, as well as opportunities for experiential reflection. Our events take place both in person and online. And we are delighted this afternoon to have a very particular and unusual conversation hosted between ourselves and, as I've said already, a Cumberland Lodge. Before I introduce Fergus to you, I would just like to note where we are in St Paul's Cathedral. If you know St Paul's, you will know where you are. If you don't, you may not so much. This is the OBE chapel, and it is the chapel dedicated to members of the honours, holding honours in the British Empire. And so therefore it is rather lovely that our speaker this afternoon is an OBE. So shortly we will welcome him, but for now I would just like to say welcome home, Rory. Over to you, Fergus.
Thank you ever so much, Paula, and thank you all for coming, battling through the heat, the tourists, and now to the intellectual sanctity and the slightly lower temperature of the OBE chapel. So thank you all for coming. I'm Chief Executive of Cumberland Lodge, and it's wonderful to have you all here. For those of you who don't know what Cumberland Lodge is, we are an educational charity based in Windsor Great Park that was created back in 1947 by the visionary academic Amy Buller. And it's a place where young people can come together and talk about issues of social division and can support social cohesion. So to question, listen, and understand, to agree to disagree agreeably, thereby creating a more peaceful, open, inclusive society. Now, at a time of increasing populism and polarization, I couldn't think of a time that the mission of Cumberland Lodge is as important as it is. And we want to create and develop 5,000 young leaders over the next 5 years who will walk in the footsteps of people like Desmond Tutu, Kofi Annan, and Winston Churchill, who have all been through the Lodge during their time. So as a result, I couldn't think of a better person than the Right Honourable Rory Stewart OBE to talk about us and help us understand what is going on in our society and the world with regard to populism, the challenge of AI, and the role that young people can have in supporting that journey of social cohesion. It's wonderful to see so many people, young people, joining us today. So Rory needs no introduction, but I will introduce him anyway. A former UK Cabinet Minister, diplomat, and best-selling author, Rory brings a unique perspective from extensive experience across the Middle East and as the MP for Penrith and the Border. His acclaimed books, including Politics on the Edge and his latest, Middleland, explore the complexities of governance, community, and identity. However, I think you're all here because of the podcast. So just out of interest, how many people, a show of hands, regularly listen to The Rest is Politics? You're speaking to the choir. Fabulous. So thank you so much for coming, Rory. We're really looking forward to your thoughts, and then we're really looking forward to the Q&A that will come. Rory.
Firstly, are you able to hear me? Very good, thank you. So I think being in a cathedral, being told that I'm preaching to the choir is always a bit depressing. I'm not sure, maybe the dean can tell us, but I'm not sure the choir pays much attention to sermons if they're there all the time. Anyway, thank you. I'm going to try to lay out a little bit of a picture of how I think we got to where we are. Age of populism, and I'm going to suggest 4 main things that we look at: politics, economics, international relations, and technology. Look at some of these trends and some suggestions on where we might be going and what we could do about them. Let me begin, though, with a history lesson. That again's a bit putting off, a bit sort of preaching to the choir again. But essentially, I think it's useful to think about the world in terms of 3 recent ages. 1989 to 2004 is my first age. 2004 to 2014, and 2014 to today. And that's largely because for most of us in the room, these are ages that we can relate to. Imagine those of us who are older in the room, this is within our working lives. Those of us younger in the room, presumably, hopefully, at least within our lives. 1989 to 2004 is a good starting point, I think, because it is the sort of anti-populism age. It's the high point of a particular vision of the world, and a particular vision of politics, economics, international relations, and technology. In politics, it's the age in which it feels as though liberal democracy has triumphed. So 1989, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall, then 91, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's a moment where, as the old structures collapse, on the left, the old kind of communist autocratic structures, on the right, the old structures of military government are replaced by an explosion of liberal democracy. So the number of democracies in the world literally doubles from 1988 to 2003. You have new democracies in Latin America, new democracies in Asia, new democracies in Africa, and perhaps most dramatically of all, new democracies in Central and Eastern Europe. So this is the journey of countries like Lithuania and Romania from being pretty poor autocracies towards what you would see if you were to go to Lithuania today, right, a vibrant democratic state. And it's a reminder of how the world by the mid-1990s was a world quite unlike the world of the 1970s. Right? 1970s, you're still in a world in which much of Latin America is actually run by colonels and generals. These are countries run by people in uniform. Where South Korea, Taiwan are still basically autocratic states before you get on to the whole Eastern Bloc. You go from a world of kind of strong men, and they're almost entirely men, towards a world of elections and changes of parties. That's one big revolution. Economically, of course, the big revolution is this is the moment at which a particular vision of how to run your economy triumphs. So 1989, 2004, it's the triumph of the Thatcher-Reagan revolution. Broadly speaking, neoliberalism, privatization, deregulation, and above all, globalization. It's the great moment of free trade. It's the moment where NAFTA is formed, which brings Mexico, Canada, and the United States together in a single market. The European single market, it's the moment of the European single market. And it's also the moment where in 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization. So it's a moment of explosion in global trade growing almost twice as fast as the global economy. And the theory is that these two things, democracy and free markets, go together. Broadly speaking, the story that we were told is the freer you were, the more competitive you were, the more your economies grew, and then the richer you became and the bigger your middle class became, the more you would demand rights and the vote. And in fact, there's a lovely chart that you can draw from about 1803 to about 2003, which suggests that all the wealthiest, most prosperous countries in the world are democracies. And in fact, there was a whole trend in academic thought called modernization theory, where you basically extend this 200-year graph. And it would imply that by today, we would almost all be liberal democracies and free market states. In international relations, the third underpinning of this is what we call the rules-based international order, something that really sort of emerged under American tutelage from the end of the Second World War, and it's an idea that America comes out of the Second World War. It's enormous economically, the only country to have come out of the Second World War economically stronger. It's about 50% of the global economy. It's got a nuclear weapon when no one else has. And instead of saying, terrific, we've got a nuclear bomb, we're about half the world economy, we're going to conquer you all and subjugate you all, America did something rather unusual, which is it decided to conceal its power in a whole series of alliances and international institutions. So the United Nations, NATO, the World Bank, the IMF, and then American development assistance through something called the Marshall Plan, rebuilding Germany, Japan, Europe after the war. America, in other words, betting that in the long run, if it set up these international institutions, the world would be more prosperous, more peaceful, more stable, and in the long run, the United States would benefit from this system. Now, in the short term, they might be able to extract a little bit more by invading and conquering us all, but in the long run, these rules, this system, would be in everybody else's interest, which would also be in their interest. So quite an optimistic vision of the world. And the fourth element of this world was a particular media technology landscape. This is the world in which everybody's still watching the same anchors on the evening news. Everybody's still reading the same newspapers. And these things, in America, 4 main television networks, generating huge amounts of money. Newspaper advertising, $50 billion a year. Everyone's sitting down every evening in their tens of millions. If you're in the United States, watching people like Walter Cronkite, or in Britain, various people called Dimbleby, right? Telling you how to think about the world. And not surprisingly, what they tell you how to think about the world is basically about liberal democracy, free markets, and a rules-based international order. And we know what the world is. We all know what the world is. We're all going to be Denmark. It's really all you need to know. From 1989 to 2004, we're all going to be Denmark. And the graph of public opinion, not very surprisingly, is a bell jar. All the votes are in the center ground. We're all about the third way. This is the key moment of Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, where they put all these things together: globalization, liberal democracy, human rights, rules-based international order. They're intervening in Bosnia and Kosovo to end wars. They're writing constitutions for the whole world. They're restructuring the Russian bond markets. Putin's coming to hang out at the G8. And we're all going to be a bigger version of Denmark. Right. And then, oddly, the world pushes back in a way that's a little bit disturbing for all those people who've been writing lovely books on modernization theory, or the great New York Times columnist Tom Friedman, who had an entire industry for 15 years of writing articles telling you that the whole world was getting more peaceful, more prosperous, more orderly. He had various ideas such as 2 countries with McDonald's would never go to war with each other. It's a kind of beautiful encapsulation of the idea that if you tie into the global economic system, peace and prosperity will follow. And indeed, there's lovely data on all this. During this period, it seems as though every year the number of refugees is declining, the number of civilians killed in conflict is declining, the number of internally displaced people is declining, the number of conflicts around the world is declining, the number of people living in extreme poverty is declining, right? We've gone from more than half the world's population extreme poverty at the end of the Second World War to barely 10%. And in fact, we're going to make poverty history. We've got Millennium Development Goals. We've got Sustainable Development Goals. And we are imagining a world in which there's not going to be any more poor people by 2000 or by 2015, depending on where we're shifting, or by 2030, wherever we're shifting this deadline. And then, Well, what happens? Well, what happens between 2004 and 2014 is most of these assumptions are shattered. Politically, the assumption around liberal democracy is shattered by China. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall falls, it's the same year where in Tiananmen Square in China, a pro-democratic movement happens, and you will all remember the great image of the single man confronting the tanks. And for a moment, it feels as though China is going to follow the model of every other country in the world. Liberal democracy is coming, its middle class is growing, the vote is coming, and it'll be free. Now, China does not go on that path. Instead of which, China breaks the relationship between economic growth and liberal democracy in a spectacular fashion. End of our first period, 2003, China is the 7th largest economy in the world. Its economy is still smaller than Italy. 2004, it becomes bigger than the French economy. 2005, bigger than the British economy. 2006, bigger than the German economy. 2007, bigger than the Japanese economy. By 2014, China is the world's largest manufacturer and the world's largest exporter, and it has not become a liberal democracy. Second thing, 2008, the financial crisis. 2008, the financial crisis begins to rip open some of the assumptions we have about neoliberal economics. Maybe not the crisis itself, but the crisis opens a box into which we peer, and we become much more conscious of the ways in which markets are not working, not delivering for us. We become much more conscious of the fact that inequality of different sorts is radically on the rise. Beginning of our first period, the top 400 people in the United States have a wealth which is about 1/3 of that of the bottom 50% of Americans. By 2008, the top 400 wealthiest people in the United States are 3 times wealthier than the bottom 50% of Americans. The CEO's salaries go from being about a 75 multiple of the average mean worker to being about 250 multifold. And gaps between regions soar. The difference between being in Makerfield and London, or between Michigan and Massachusetts, become very, very stark. Inequalities of wealth become very dramatic. Encapsulated, for example, in sort of inequality that we often don't talk about. Right? It's very tempting to think that it's about the top 1% against the bottom 90%. But this is a form of inequality where the majority of the people in this room will be better off. And that is inequality of wealth summed up in housing. What's the basic inequality of wealth in our society? It's between people who own houses and people who don't. The 60% who own and the 40% who don't, right? The 60% who own are much better off generally than the 40% who don't, who tend to be younger, struggling to get on the housing ladder. Third thing, international relations, rules-based international order, cracked apart by the catastrophic interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are $4 trillion wars, $4,000 billion spent, right? And nothing is achieved. Nothing's achieved, right? We invade to get rid of the Afghan Taliban. We spend 20 years on the ground. We hand the country back to the Taliban again. And finally, the whole world of the sort of Dimblebees and Cronkites is broken with the advent of social media and the smartphone. This happens 2005, 6, 8, and very quickly. End of 2010, beginning of 2011, we see the results of this in the Arab Spring. What happens in the Arab Spring? Well, thanks to phones and Facebook and Twitter, somebody setting himself alight in a small town in Tunisia immediately sparks, within a few weeks, revolution in Tunisia, then in Libya, then in Egypt, then in Syria, then in Lebanon, then in Bahrain, then in Yemen. And it's not just that we're suddenly finding political movements crossing thousands of miles of territory, crossing boundaries, going to every form of different social and constitutional system in the Middle East. We're also beginning to see an impact a little bit like chaos theory. In chaos theory, of course, with weather, the butterfly flaps its wings in Guatemala, and we end up with some rain in London. But in this case, a man sets himself alight in a small town in Tunisia. Syria then collapses. 3 million refugees go into Turkey, 1 million refugees cross the Mediterranean into Europe, and suddenly now we have a link between, through immigration and the opposition to immigration, the position of Nigel Farage in the British electoral setup and somebody setting himself alight in a small town in Tunisia. And these algorithms reinforce a complete inversion in the graph of public opinion, right? Public opinion goes from being a bell jar and it collapses into a U-shape. The votes are no longer where my fingers are, they're now where my elbows are. We have entered a world of polarization. And from 2014 onwards, all these chickens come home to roost. 2014, Vladimir Putin invades Crimea, shifting the borders of Europe by force. 2014, Narendra Modi, a populist nationalist, is elected for the first time in India. 2014, ISIS, the Islamic State, creates a huge caliphate across the Syria-Iraqi border. 2015, the Law and Justice Party is elected in Poland. 2016, we have the Brexit referendum. 2018, Bolsonaro is elected in Brazil. And of course, in 2016, we have the first election of Donald Trump. But it's with the second election of Donald Trump that we actually go through the looking glass and enter the shadow world of our first age. So if the first age is defined by liberal democracy, the age of Trump 2 is defined by authoritarian populism. If the first age is defined by globalization and free trade, the age of second Trump is defined by protectionism and tariffs. If the first age is defined by a rules-based international order, the age of Trump 2 is defined by isolationism, America first, and if the first age is defined by a very hierarchical, organized media landscape, the new age is defined not just by social media, but increasingly by artificial intelligence. What does this mean? Well, it means we have entered a world of radical unpredictability. Right? From 1945 to 2004, broadly all good-thinking people agreed, because we were all trying to be Denmark. The whole world was going to be Denmark. Now we are in a world where those things don't apply. Our fundamental economic models are no longer agreed on. Our fundamental political models are no longer agreed on. Let's take the political models. Liberal democracy. I didn't unpack it completely, but what was the story about liberal democracy? Well, if you had gone, as many of you in this room doubtless will have gone, to the Hay-on-Wye Literary Festival, right? You would have turned up in 2004 and you would have heard Michael Ignatieff, right, a man who made his career at the BBC in its height in the 80s and 90s, standing up and saying very earnestly, democracy is based on the combination of majority representation and the protection of minority rights. And everybody would have nodded their heads, and we would have heard about the separation of powers, heard about an independent judiciary, the rule of law, governance. We would have heard about the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And we would have been able to produce a beautiful story. Michael at the stage was the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, so right at the heart of this whole movement, would have told you that all these things go together. That, what was holding back the Saudi economy, is that they hadn't given full rights to women, and they hadn't given people to vote. And that it was in their economic interest to do so, because it was transform their productive capacity once you got these people into the workforce, and as they became more democratic, and as they became more prosperous, they would become more peaceful and get on with their neighbors. Finally, in international relations, of course, we've entered a world of really radical unpredictability, right? The world of 45 to 2004 is, of course, a much more messy world than I have described, right? It's very easy to become naive and starry-eyed about it. The truth of the matter is, you don't even need to be Noam Chomsky to point out that frequently the United States and its allies were brutal, hypocritical, dishonest. And indeed, it was much more obvious to you if you lived in Latin America than if you lived in Europe, right? And if you were putting up with the CIA trying to assassinate your head of state or funding militia groups or pitching in behind military dictators, maybe this whole story about liberal democracy, globalization, rules-based international order would look a bit more dodgy. Nevertheless, the rhetoric and the constitutional structures and the international rules at least provided a little bit of friction. People were still required to try to justify themselves. US presidents were still supposed to, before they went to war, talk to Congress. They were still supposed, before they went round assassinating people in boats off the coast of Colombia, to mount some kind of legal argument that involved some kind of movement from an attorney general and the Department of Justice. If they launched some great international campaign that involved using other people's air bases, they at least felt maybe they could pick up the phone in advance before they did so. They may frequently have had dodgy dossiers and lied and misrepresented themselves, but they did at least attempt to make arguments at the United Nations, however partial those arguments were, and tried to assemble coalitions behind them. And how did they assemble coalitions? They assembled it, even at their worst, the most hypocritical, George W. Bush in Iraq, which is a pretty bad example, but he was still doing it in the name of democracy, freedom, liberty, human rights. These were the kinds of arguments that they were trying to use. When you enter a world in which none of that applies, in which the President of the United States feels no necessity to consult with Congress, discuss anything with his allies, has actually brings sanctions against the International Criminal Court, refuses to allow UN member states to even turn up in New York to the UN General Assembly, supports declaring the Secretary General of the United Nations persona non grata, cuts all funding, and when the Vice President of the United States, a Yale law graduate, is asked for the legal grounds on which they are killing Colombian and Venezuelans in ships off the coast of Colombia and Venezuela, says, I quote, "I do not give an F." Right? I don't care what the legal argument is or isn't. You enter a world of radical unpredictability. But you also, and this is what I'm going to sort of try to conclude on, you also enter a world in which sovereignty suddenly matters in a way that it didn't before. Sovereignty really matters. The truth of the matter is that none of us, of course, is an island. Right? I'm now sounding like I'm speaking to the choir again. Okay? But in fact, there's a St. Paul's reference there. That was good. A bit of John Donne, need to get that in. But we have made ourselves incredibly dependent around the world on the United States. Right? We did something that nobody in global history would ever have done. In fact, in the sense, the First World War originated from the fact that neither Germany nor the United Kingdom could tolerate another power being preponderant. Right? This is the idea of the Thucydides trap, the idea that a rising power is necessarily a threat to the established powers, and nobody will let them get that kind of power. That's why Sparta goes to war with Athens, right? Why everybody goes to war with Napoleon. But we allowed the United States to put itself in a position in which it controlled almost everything. The United States is 70% of the global stock exchange. The dollar constitutes well over 90% of all financial transactions in the world. All the payment systems in the world depend on the United States. Visa and MasterCard underlie almost all the credit card transactions in the world. All the cloud computing, right, and your information is no longer on your laptop, it's up in the cloud, basically sits in the United States. It sits with Amazon, it sits with Google, it sits with Microsoft. All the advanced computer chips in the world are manufactured and owned by a company called NVIDIA, located in the United States of America. 70% approximately of all the defense equipment purchased by the United Kingdom comes from the United States of America. Europe, the Middle East, India has no equivalent to the Patriot missile. Right? We have nothing like it. We have no weapons that allow us to do those kinds of things. We're forced to buy American F-35 fighter planes. And now increasingly, we are entirely dependent on American artificial intelligence models, right? These companies, Anthropic, which is Claude, OpenAI, right, which is ChatGPT, these are American-based companies. They are companies with enormous data centers, enormous suites of chips. They will spend $740 billion over the next 3 years rolling out their next generation of frontier models. And we are being asked to build our entire society, economy, defense, and security on top of those American systems, right? Palantir is going to do all the data and decisions within the NHS. Claude is going to underpin all our weapons targeting systems. ChatGPT is going to power the productivity transformation of our legal services, consultancy, engineering. Our software engineers are going to be replaced by American AI. Our call centers are going to be replaced by American AI. Now, how do we get ourselves into that situation? Well, we got ourselves into that situation because they seem to be so nice. It was inconceivable at any time from 1945 that they would ever do anything with this situation. It was a company town, you know. It's one of these things the Wedgwoods used to run. You know, you turn up, you work in their factory, they build the school, they give you the house, you happily sit there, you move your whole family to live in the company town, and then suddenly a new owner comes along and says, oh, well, you don't have a home anymore, you don't have a school anymore, you don't have a job anymore, all you have is dependent on me, and I'm going to start charging you for those things. In other words, I'm going to start turning an alliance into an extortion racket. Right, the first signs of that are when the United States, which had built enormous bases in the Middle East for its own interests, now turns around to the government of Qatar and says, you will pay us $1.2 billion a year for the privilege of having our base in your country. Right? Or when the US turns around to Spain and says, if you don't let our planes land, I'm going to put tariffs against you. Or turns around to Denmark and says, you will hand over Greenland. Or as happened on Sunday, the US government has suddenly announced that the most advanced frontier AI model in the world, right, the new Mythos product of Anthropic, is not going to be available to anybody who is not an American citizen. In other words, all these things that you build, and NHS, and defense, and security, you can't access the latest models. No, if there's going to be any advantage to any of this stuff, it's going to go to Americans, and nobody else is going to have it. And what do we do about it? Nothing. We hope for the best. Right? Stick our heads in the ground, wave our little feathery tails around, say maybe, you know, AI is not really going to work out, maybe the Americans are wasting their money. Right? Essentially, we are in the position, somebody facing, let's say we're like the Imperial China in 1850, facing the arrival of the British gunships. And we're saying, well, the British say they've got all this stuff going with coal and steam and steel, but maybe it's not going to work out. And maybe if we keep studying the Confucian classics and I keep doing my calligraphy properly, the whole thing's going to be fine, right? Now, where does this all lead us? Because I brought you here with Cumberland Lodge to talk about young people and our solution and how we deal with an age like this. So here I would suggest that the answer lies in Aristotle. And in particular, in Aristotle's rhetoric. So Aristotle in the rhetoric says that there are three things that matter, right? They are what he calls logos, ethos, and pathos. So logos, the word, again, I sound like I'm becoming a clergyman again, but in this case, logos represents the idea of facts, information, knowledge, reality, right? So the first response to populism is logos, because populism is based in the idea of post-truth. Interestingly, not really necessarily in the idea of a lie, but simply in the idea of bullshit, the idea that truth, lie, doesn't really matter. If you're Donald Trump, suits you and it's funny, you might tell the truth sometimes. Sometimes you might lie. It doesn't really matter. What you're not interested in is the relationship between your words and reality. You're simply interested in navigating your way through whatever speech or event you happen to be in. So logos is important because the real moral problem with the populist is their inability to deal with the notion of truth, and the pragmatic problem with the populist is their inability to formulate credible policy, right? What are they really about? They're about pointing out problems. What do they not have? Solutions. Right? We are on the 10th anniversary of this remarkable thing called Brexit, right? What was Brexit about? Brexit was about pointing out problems. Britain's too regulated. Britain has too many immigrants. Britain is uncompetitive. Europe is not growing. Right? So that's the problem. Solution, apparently, Brexit. Right? 10 years on, Britain remains overregulated, uncompetitive. None of these things seem to have been fixed, right? Because the problem was real, the solution just doesn't work. The solution actually is the classic populist solution, always is the classic populist solution, which is when you have problems, you blame someone else, right? It's the classic nationalist solution. But it's also true in our own lives, right? When our own life is going wrong, we're tempted to think, well, if I only get rid of my partner or don't see my friends, everything will be better. It's them. They're making my life rubbish. And if I could just sort of hunker down, everything will be okay. So if you're a Scottish nationalist, get rid of London, United Kingdom, everything's going to be much better. Or in our case, get rid of Europe, it's all going to be much, much better. Right? Or, get rid of some other group. Right? Could be a minority ethnic group. Could be get rid of old Etonians. That would be a popular one in this room. All going to be much better off, right? Okay. The second thing I think you take from Aristotle is the idea of pathos, communication. We are in a world driven by Instagram, driven by TikTok, driven by YouTube Shorts, with a very short attention span, competing with people who are absolute masters in this, who can generate 10 million views with 2-minute clips about absolutely nothing. And they are slick, and they're authentic, and they're funny, and they've got a great knack for it. You cannot, in this world, I would say to a young person, model yourself, despite his many merits, on Sir Keir Starmer. Right? This is not the way to win in the modern media environment, right? You have to, I'm sorry, you have to be able to communicate. You can be a wonderful human being and not communicate. What you cannot be is a wonderful politician and be unable to communicate. Politics ultimately is about the public. It's about translation, it's about talking to people, and it would help if the anti-populists had a sense of humor. The third thing that we need is ethos. Now, ethos for Aristotle is character, but ethos is also at the foundation of our notion of ethics, right? Morality. In the end, the fundamental response to the populist must be ethical, right? Not prudential, not communicative, right? Ultimately, what you're saying in relation to the populist is not, I can guarantee that my policies will deliver more growth, or I'm funnier than you are, but that I am based on a particular view of the world which has a moral foundation. And in the end, Right? To go back to the mistakes of the earlier period, what made democracy was not its generation of economic growth. That was always a very vulnerable way of describing the point of human rights, the point of votes, was not that it was going to make us grow faster, nor should the fact that China or Saudi Arabia is growing like Billy-O prove that democracy is a waste of time. Right? Democracy is inherently valuable because of what it says about us, about our dignity, about our relationship to each other, about our equal value. Right? All these things which seem accidental components of democracy, the fact that we each have exactly the same vote, one person, one vote, or the fact that we have a jury system where 12 random individuals get to judge, or the fact that we have parliaments that debate things, all of this enshrines a vision of humanity, a vision of equality, of the fact that we have equal dignity, that I am, at a fundamental level, no better than you are, and you're no better than I am. Right? This is very, very fundamental. And that means that democracy is also about persuasion, and it's about compromise. And it's about diversity of views. Because in the end, the idea of the democracy is that there isn't a right answer. There isn't a Xi Jinping or a Donald Trump who knows exactly what to do. We are not a society run by engineers. Our problems are not engineering problems. They are problems of values, where we have perfectly legitimate reasons to disagree with each other, because we have different forms of attachment and different forms of knowledge. You know, you live in Milton Keynes, you live in Cumbria. That in and of itself gives you a reason to have a conversation where you might disagree with each other. I care about building an AI data center. You care about trying to conserve energy. That is a real reason for a debate, right? And that debate requires, firstly, the ability to compromise, right? The ability occasionally to say, I think I'm right, but I'm going to give way, because we've talked about this long enough and the majority of people in this room disagree with me. But also requires the ability that I can persuade you and you can persuade me in return. Right? That I'm able to talk to you in a way that appeals to your logic, your education, your good sense, but I also have enough empathy and humility to listen to you and realize that I too could be wrong. So on that, I'm going to conclude as we go to questions. I've set out a huge historical thing, but it is in Aristotle that I end, that the answer to this is logos, pathos, and ethos. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Rory, so much for, as expected, a tour de force, and ending with Aristotle, I think, is a great place for us to start. So it's my job just to ask you a few questions to put some lines in the water to get us going, and then we'll hand over to the audience, who I'm sure will do us proud. I was fascinated with your comments about the US concealed their powers through the UN, NATO, and the World Trade Organization. And so therefore, the rise of populism today, do you see that as a failure of political leadership, economic systems, our cultural institutions, or a kind of merging of all three?
My guess is that what we call populism, and we can articulate it in different ways. It could be post-truth, it could be polarization. These things draw on deep, universal aspects of human nature that have always been there. Right? Populism's not new, nationalism's not new. And at its heart is an idea that, an anti-democratic idea, an anti-pluralist idea, that there is a real people whose will needs to be implemented, and that the other people are not real people. Right? They could be the minority, they could even be the majority, but they're not real people. We are the people, and we get to do what we want, and we won't be constrained. We won't be constrained by laws, we won't be constrained by separation of power, because we all know what's right. I'm going to do it, right? This is not an unusual perspective on the world. It's, in fact, the unusual thing, maybe, the counterintuitive thing, is that we actually managed to build liberal democracies at all. I presume that if you were to talk to Caesar or Alexander the Great, or Robespierre during the French Revolution, they probably would say, or Lenin, they probably would say, they speak for the popular will, that laws are simply things that get in the way, and they need to get on and get stuff done. They know best, and the people who are stopping them are a bunch of traitors, right? It's a very, very remarkable achievement that we managed to create a situation in which the rights of minorities were respected, in which laws were put above the will of the individual, and it was a very tense, complicated historical process, right? I mean, King John signs Magna Carta and then he rejects it, right? His son doesn't really want to sign it. I mean, it's a long time before you can get this stuff to really bed in, right? So the real point, I suspect, must be that most of the drivers of populism have always been there in our souls and within our society. What's interesting is what is it in the last 10 or 15 years which have allowed them to explode? And my guess is that there will be 20, 30 different historical factors, and there'll be something in all of them. And depending on your politics, you will identify a different one. If you will say it's because of austerity, or it's because of inequality, or it's because of deindustrialization, or it's because of the China shock, or it's because of the rise of immigration. Right? It could mean a number of things. My guess, though, is that probably the real proximate driving cause is technology and social media. Because that's the only thing that explains why it's happening simultaneously in so many different countries. Right? It's happening in countries that had austerity. It's happening in countries that didn't have austerity. It's happening in countries which aren't having economic growth, and it's happening in countries which have prodigious economic growth. It's happening in countries with very extreme inequality, and it's happening in countries with less inequality. Right? And it's happening so quickly, it's unlikely to be driven by slow, deep, demographic, economic changes.
Wonderful. I'm fascinated, and we're thinking about a Cumberland conversation, which is what does the progressive left not understand about the populist right? Because the populist right seem to be winning. So I'm fascinated as to what do you think that populist leaders understand about public frustration that more mainstream leaders, and you mentioned Keir Starmer, seemingly don't? What are they missing?
Well, this actually is a very interesting piece of research written by a wonderful American academic, which called The Righteous Mind, which analyzes the way that progressives think about the right and the way that the right thinks about progressives. And he did a series of very complex opinion polls and studies across the United States, in which he discovered that basically progressives in the United States, mostly voters of the Democratic Party, were incredibly bad at understanding Republican voters. And Republican voters were remarkably good at understanding Democratic voters. So, for example, if you ask a Democratic voter, are Republican voters likely to be in favor of cruelty to animals? 60% of Democratic voters think the majority of Republican voters would be in favor of cruelty to animals. The truth, spoiler alert, is the majority of Republican voters are strongly against cruelty to animals. That's not an important part of their right-wing identity, right? If, on the other hand, you ask a right-wing voter to try to describe roughly what a progressive worldview is, they usually get it pretty accurately. They understand roughly what the progressive left think about the world. They tend to think, in fact, that the progressive left is well-intentioned but a bit impractical, and they're quite good at describing what they think well-intentioned people believe. Whereas the left find it almost impossible to imagine the right. I mean, I interviewed Angela Rayner, and I said, look, one of the problems that you're struggling with, I think, is winning over the center ground of politics. You know, here I am, I'm a disaffected Tory, I'm now an independent, I should be voting for you. What do you think somebody like me believes? What is it that you'd have to say to me to get me to vote for you? And she just couldn't do it. It's so deep in her mind that the Tories are evil and Labour's good, that even beginning to think about the sort of values that I might have or the sort of moves she might make to get me on side is almost impossible. Right? So I think that's the first problem, is the problem of the righteous mind. The right also, and here we're now talking about the far right, rely on the fact that the progressive left is always suffering from a version of Trump derangement syndrome. So they're always able to feed off the fact that the left will want to see Trump or Nigel Farage as though they're Adolf Hitler. And most of these people are not Adolf Hitler, right? They're, from my point of view, extremely bad human beings and would be very bad prime ministers, but they're not Adolf Hitler, right? But this is a problem, right? If you insist on projecting onto the other side a vision of them that's not realistic, it doesn't work. Now, then what does the right understand about the British public? Well, they understood a long time before the left that the British public overwhelmingly is anxious about immigration. Now, the right may not worry too much about whether the public are correct to be worried about immigration or not correct to be worried about immigration. They simply know that the majority of the public care a lot about immigration. The left would spend their whole time saying, actually, rather interestingly, what they want to say is people ought not to care about immigration, but what they end up saying is people don't care about immigration because they can't bear the possibility that people might care about something they ought not to care about, right? And this means that we get into very interesting conversations, right? Again, because it allows the right to say things which are perfectly straightforward and which the left can't say. For example, it is ridiculous, completely ridiculous, that people are getting on boats from France to come to Britain. France is a safe country. Our asylum laws are about safety. They are designed for people who are female judges in Afghanistan, people being murdered in Sudan, suffering political persecution in Somalia. They are not about people in Calais. It is ridiculous. Right? And it's also true that there is absolutely no reason on earth why you should not be able to return them back to France. Right? This is something the right would be able to say. It's something that most of you in the room, assuming most of you from the progressive left, would find a deeply, deeply uncomfortable statement. In fact, almost impossible to process, right? So it's so deeply embedded in you that somehow we must have some kind of obligation towards someone on a rubber raft coming from France, and of course we shouldn't return them back to France. So long as the progressive left is unable to say simple things that make absolute sense to 90% of the population, it's going to find it very, very difficult to mobilize the muster. Now, that doesn't mean giving in to the far right, right? It doesn't mean allowing the horror that we've seen over the last 2.5 weeks, which is political leaders essentially endorsing race riots, refusing to stand up for the police, minorities, public order in horrendous cases of violence and abuse, right? But it does mean being able to do something pretty straightforward, which is sound normal. Occasionally say, yeah, well, that does sound a bit odd. Well, yeah, maybe it is true that that's happening, or maybe what you think you see in Cumbria is correct. Maybe there is something a bit bonkers about it. That's a final example, just to wind up everyone in this room, okay? If it were true that Britain has the best clean energy policy in the world, and that clean energy is cheap energy, why are our energy costs 4 times higher than the United States and twice as high as Europe, which is crippling our industry and crippling any ability to move ahead in technology? The answer is obvious. It's not cheaper. Now, we might be doing it for very good reasons, but we're subsidizing it. Yeah, you can hide the subsidies in any number of ways. You can add it up in any number of ways. You can count kilowatt hours in any number of ways. But in the end, you can see it on your bills. It's more expensive. And if you continue to deny what everybody in industry, in business, and the public can see, you're in trouble. So 2 provocative examples, immigration and energy, to try to illustrate why we have a problem understanding the right.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. I'm now going to hand over to Paula, who's going to marshal the questions that have been coming in.
I am indeed. Good news, the technology is working, so you can send it via technology. But if you've got a handwritten question, now is your moment to start waving. My colleagues will come and collect them from you. We've got lots of questions, so let's see how far we can go. One kind of very poignant question is that today is, of course, the 10th anniversary of the death of Joe Cox. And 10 years later, politics feels more divided even than then. What lessons do we need to be learning on this 10th anniversary of the death of Joe Cox?
Well, I mean, I think the most fundamental one is sympathy across parties. I think we've become madly partisan. You know, the fact that we now know that the Russian state funded an arson attack on the private home of the Prime Minister and his family, and elected politicians in the House of Commons are not showing their support for the Prime Minister because they're from different parties is completely unimaginable, right? You know, 10 years ago, we would all rather sort of pompously have been standing up and say, we may be from a different party, but, you know, we commiserate with the Prime Minister. The fact that we've lost that is extraordinary, and I think that would have astonished Jo. I mean, she's right, there is more in common than divides us, but my goodness, we're doing our best to find the division. Yeah.
I just lost the next question that I was looking for.
It's my fault, I'm trying to reply more quickly, so I get more questions.
Let's say that populism is primarily a symptom rather than a cause. What specific reforms should liberal democracies make to rebuild trust before voters conclude that the entire model no longer works? I thought was a rather elegant question.
Yeah, well, the answer is we can do things structurally. So I would argue that we would be helped by a different voting system. You know, I think the first past the post system doesn't make sense. I actually believe in other things that will be unpopular with some people, compulsory voting. I believe in much, much more devolution. I think, you know, Manchester is a good example of how much better places do when they run their own affairs, and we should be pushing more power out of London. I would like to use citizens' assemblies much more, which again, you know, we could talk about in much more detail. So there are constitutional things we can do, which I think would make Britain better off, but they're insufficient. Because, you know, I used to turn up in Australia a year and a half ago and say, Australia has most of those things. Isn't it wonderful you've got all those things, you haven't got populism? Now Pauline Hanson and the One Nation Party, which is their sort of Farage plus equivalent, is running at 30%, and their two main parties are about 20%. In other words, Australia has caught the same disease despite having the kind of constitutional structures that I would recommend. Right? So it's clearly not sufficient. I think it's fundamentally, we have lost all trust and respect for politicians. And without trust and respect for politicians, almost nothing works. It's a sort of cultural problem. Because when you cease to trust and respect the politicians, they cease to trust and respect themselves. And they become the very worst versions of themselves. I mean, you are basically their employer. And if you approach the people that you employ with the view that they are corrupt, incompetent, and idle, they begin to shrug their shoulders and think, well, I might as well be corrupt, incompetent, and idle if these people all think I'm corrupt, incompetent, and idle. It's astonishing when you turn up in the House of Commons, what a really bad culture that is. I mean, useless, right? Useless. And yet the individuals were quite talented, interesting people before they entered the House of Commons. I mean, it's amazing. You know, you may have seen this in, you know, a regiment that goes bad or a school that goes bad, how you can end up creating a really horrible culture where even a reasonably good teacher simply can't operate. But the House of Commons is that on steroids. I mean, it's astonishing. It's so bad. So bad. And how do you fix that? Well, they need to have some self-respect. They need to have some standards. They need to start making better speeches. They need to start thinking more seriously about policy. They need to treat each other with more respect. They need to believe in what they're doing. But how on earth do you achieve that when an institution's gone rotten? I'm not sure.
I've got a couple from our younger members of the audience, so I thought we would go focus on that for the next two questions. The first is, what could or should young people do to counter populism? And the question said in the US, but you might want to say generally, whichever you would prefer to do. Is there something specifically that younger people might be able to think about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the answer is I'm afraid, not being a radical revolutionary on the other side. I mean, most of many young people who talk to me about their fight against populism are incredibly intolerant, incredibly radical, and incredibly self-righteous. And actually, what is required is much more humility, empathy, nuance. Right? Fundamentally, the answer to the populist is not you're wrong and Yanis Varoufakis and Gary Stevenson are right. It is I may be wrong, you may be wrong. This is a pretty complicated world. There's a lot of different things to trade off here. We've all got to live together, and we're going to try to work our way through this with energy, but also with a great deal of humility.
So my second one, this is a rather fun one, I think. For previous generations, technology has been a route to progress for the young. Now it appears to be their enemy. Can that change, or should under 25s all become Luddites?
Look, the Luddites had a point, right? And we tend to sort of reject them, because the story is, these guys were smashing up machines at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in order to protect their jobs as hand loom weavers, and how foolish they were, because, we're now in a much, much better world 250 years later. And this is used by the tech bros to say that anyone who asks questions about AI is a Luddite who is superstitiously holding back this incredible progress that's going to transform our healthcare, our education, our prosperity, our productivity. Firstly, be very suspicious of that argument, right? You are allowed to ask questions about technology, and you're also allowed to say, if this thing is going to be as powerful for good as you claim, surely it can be equally powerful for evil. In other words, if this thing is so extraordinary that it's going to increase the size of the US economy tenfold and drive up productivity by 60%, what is this productivity if it doesn't involve laying off a lot of people? Right? What is productivity in the end? It's probably fewer workers than a company. Right? If this thing is so incredible at mounting attacks on Russia, couldn't it be pretty incredible at mounting attacks on us? Right? If this thing is so brilliant at cyber defense, wouldn't it be incredibly good at cyber attack? If this thing is so good at, coming up with medicines, wouldn't it be brilliant at making viruses? And if you keep saying, we don't understand this thing, it's magical, and every 2 years, or every 6 months, or every 6 weeks, it's far cleverer than it was before, and we don't really know how this is happening, can you not understand why some of us might say, whoa, what do you mean you don't understand why this is happening, and this whole thing keeps getting better? And finally, you might say to them, if you were a young person, listen, you, dear Elon Musk, Sam Altman, we know from your biographies that you spent your entire childhood reading science fiction stories in which artificial intelligence and robots take over the world. In how many of those stories is it a happy story? Right? And so why are we accelerating towards that world? And so I think that is a very difficult thing for younger people, because I think they understand technology much better than most older people, right? They actually are using AI much more in their everyday lives, and they can feel what it's doing to their minds, to their sense of vocation, to their sense of opportunities, their sense of jobs. And I think their sense is it is quite different to other revolutions which appeared to give an advantage to young people. The first days of social media seemed to be great because it allowed everybody to become a content creator. This thing seems a bit more dubious. And I think we are really in an odd world in which the governments and the tech bros are saying no regulation, full steam ahead. And most of the informed public, I think, is a bit nervous about the speed and direction of this stuff.
We've got a good number of questions about faith coming in. It's almost like we're in a cathedral. So let's ask the question around faith, which is, what role do you see for faith and faiths and people of faith of all kinds in the political future? If any, I should add.
literally, if you really want to shut me up, this is a good one. Yeah. I was asked to give a sermon in Oxford last year, so nothing's made me more terrified. Well, I think the first thing is that there is a very, very deep and disturbing rise in Islamophobia. And in many ways, some of the most eloquent and thoughtful voices that have spoken in defense of Islam have been from Christian clergy of all sorts. I don't want to simply flatter the Church of England that's done a good job on this. The Pope also, made a real business of making some of his early visits to the Islamic world. And this is really important because we are beginning to develop a society in which a narrative is emerging that there is a good thing called, for some reason now, Judeo-Christian culture, and a bad thing which is called Islam. And it's completely failing to capture the lived experience of Muslims, why people are proud to be Muslims, what their faith means for them. Now, I'm a Christian, right? So I'm not trying to convert you all to Islam. Right? And as a Christian, I think that Christianity is the religion I prefer to Islam, and I can explain why. Nonetheless, I think it is incumbent on us to develop deep, deep empathy, interest, and respect for people with other faiths, and not selectively. We can all be kind of woo-woo, kooky Buddhists, right? It takes a little bit more effort, right, to take an interest in Judaism or Islam. These are very, very complicated things. But the other thing that we find so difficult is being honest about the lived experience of what it means to be a Muslim, right? There's an extraordinary coming together of the critics of Islam and extreme Islamist jihadists. They have one thing in common, right? They both have a mad fundamentalist reading of Islam, right? Literally the only people who agree with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and ISIS about what Islam says about other people are the far right, who literally, I sat down with one of them who said, I said, there are 2 billion Muslims in the world. If they believed all this stuff that you think they believe, we'd all be dead, right? Right? But obviously they don't. I spent much of my life living in the Muslim world, right? They don't look at their daily practice and what people actually believe, right? I mean, I could make a similar argument, cherry-picking lines from the Old Testament to try to portray all of us as being kind of genocidal maniacs, right? But the fact is, it's not what people in practice believe, right? To which my response was, oh, well, they're not real Muslims. I said, what do you do? You're not a Muslim, and you've just said that. So, and that's another thing I want to finish on faith, right? I do wish we'd stop talking about other people's faiths when we're not from that faith. Right? I just did an extraordinary conversation with a man called Sam Harris, an American boy. He wanted to spend 3 hours arguing with me about Islam. I said, look, I'm not a Muslim, you're not a Muslim, neither of us read Arabic. Right? Why are we doing this? Right? What do you want? Should we discuss, the female menopause? I mean, any other conversation you want to discuss, which we know nothing about? I mean, why are we doing this? Right? Okay.
Final question. Your painting of history could be read in some views as being somewhat pessimistic. What gives you hope for the future?
What gives you hope for the future? Okay, let me do 2 moves. First thing is, I think one of the fundamental problems with our society is we're always trying to end on a note of optimism and hope. It's an amazingly sort of deep, dark, mad idea we have. I mean, literally, like you're sailing along on the Titanic, you've hit the iceberg, you're going down. It's like, would you give us, please, a moment of hope? Right? Okay, so the fact is, let's start not with the question of hope. Let's start with reality. Okay? And then I think you put faith and hope on top of reality. But it makes sense only if you can look unflinchingly at cruelty, at suffering, at evil within ourselves as well as within other people. You can only solve problems if you can see the problem. Right? You're only going to motivate people to make the world better if you describe how bad it is. Don't lie to people, right? I'm getting encouraged by my fellow podcaster to portray the House of Commons as a wonderful place in order to encourage young people to go and become MPs, right? Reminds me a bit like those people recruiting for the First World War, saying, oh, splendid, lots of, all be over by Christmas, nice fruitcake, bit of footy, It's horrible, right? And you can only end the First World War if you understand how horrible it is, and you can only fix our system if you accept what a danger Trump is, how useless our parliament is, how self-deluding we are. So in the end, I guess, faith and hope are not really and should not be elements of practical politics. They are the job of religion. And that fundamentally the story of faith and hope is a mystery. And it's not one that can be articulated with fact. If we believe that we will be redeemed, if we believe that we will be saved, it is not a statement about my being able to prove to you that Donald Trump is going to go on a path over the next 2 years which will result in something brilliant, or British politics somehow has some, amazing educated population that's going to necessarily do this, right? It is always a mystery. And yet, we also have a strong instinct that the prophet, the true prophet, is the prophet of hope. And the false prophet is the pessimist. And the false prophet is often right, but that doesn't make them any less of a false prophet. That hope and truth and faith are miracles and truths, but not ones that politicians can access. But this building maybe can. Thank you all.